Christian church, and at that point, Christianity is essentially subsumed into the imperial order and begins to serve the imperial needs. And I think the last thing to consider is that even though the church was in apostasy, that doesn't mean that people were necessarily all wicked. There were many very spiritual people, many people that were trying to serve the Lord in the best way that they could. And so it's not just because the institution might be in apostasy doesn't mean there weren't great Christian leaders like maybe St. Francis or somebody like that really accomplished a lot. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's a process, not an event.
Yeah. Which, of course, gets us to the need for a restoration to get back to something prior to the apostasy, because, of course, the Lord wants us to have both the authority on earth and the correct doctrine. So the fact that this process occurred means that now we have to have something to reverse the process. And that begins as part of the restoration. And, of course, one of the earliest events of that restoration is the vision that Joseph Smith received of the Father and the Son. So that's where we get to this particular lesson. And Craig, if you could give us some background on what gets us into this first vision. How did we get a young Joseph prepared to ask that question in prayer?
Sure. Religion was a hot topic, I guess you could say, during the time that led up to the first vision. For example, New York, upstate New York, was known as the burnt-over district. And we had a number of people who were searching for religion. In the process of doing that, they went to a number of camp meetings or revivals, and that kind of accentuated what was known as the Second Great Awakening. Now, some people think that the Second Great Awakening started as early as 1801 with the Cane Ridge Revival in Kentucky, but most people, I think, would agree that it really didn't start until about 1825 or so, when Charles Finney started holding revivals throughout New England, and other preachers held revivals. There were several revivals that took place right around where Joseph Smith lived, which helped cause this great interest in him to find out which church was true. And the reason why I mentioned the Burned Over District is because that was the nickname that upstate New York had at that time because of all of the revivals and because of the hot spirit, I guess you could say, of the desire to know the truth and desire to be religious, as well as the hot debates between the various religious sects. So all of that culminated, or I should say, all of that influenced Joseph Smith to the point where he wanted to go and find out, because he had read the scriptures, he had listened at the various revivals and in church meetings, and he had more questions than he had answers. And so he finally decided, after reading, in the Bible, that James 1:5, that he should go and ask. Why not go to the source? So that is what he did.
Martin, would you pick up the story from there?
I would be happy to. In verse 6 of the Joseph Smith history, he says that he had great confusion that he saw in the different sects, and this led him to a situation where he really personally was unable to come to some kind of a result through his own study and prayer and thought about which church he should join. And then, of course, he comes upon this great verse in the Epistle of James, and we read this so often that I'm not sure that it really strikes us with the depth that he says that it hit him. He said that it came with more power to his heart than any scripture that had ever come to him before. And he thought about it again and again. He reflected on it again and again, we read in verse 12. And so he came at length in verse 13 to a determination to ask God. We read in one of the first vision accounts that he goes back into the woods to the place where he had been clearing land with his father before, and he kneeled next to a stump where his axe had been stuck there from his work, and he carefully had thought about what he wanted to ask, and he asked in great faith. He said that he knew that he would receive a result, and he in fact did. Of course, the first vision happened. Before it happened, however, we read in several accounts, including the 1838 account, that there was an attempt to thwart the first vision. He had this bout with the powers of darkness. In one of the accounts, he says that he heard the sound of footsteps coming towards him. And then he tried to pray again, and he heard the sound of footsteps coming closer. He jumped up in the middle of his prayer and looked around, but could see nothing that would account for this sound that he had. This was apparently calculated by the adversary to try to make him afraid or distract him from his goal. But exerting all of his might, he began to pray, and then, of course, the first vision begins to unfold.
Now, Bill, you wanted to mention something about that particular part, about when the Lord, when God says, "This is my beloved Son."
Well, I'm not sure that I did, but you had me confused there for a minute. Let me just add one other thing before I get to that, and that is in the second half of verse 12, he says that the teachers of religion of the different sects understood the same passages of Scripture so differently as to destroy all confidence in settling the question by an appeal to the Bible. And I think that's an important thing to note, is that most of the denominations of the day claim to be basing themselves solely on the Bible, coming up with many different interpretations, and it was impossible from the Bible alone to resolve those issues. And if anything, it's worse now today in the sense that it's more confusing and more sets of interpretations than there were in Joseph Smith's day, where there was a lot of agreement on a lot of basic principles. So I think that's important to note, that the failure of the Bible to provide an adequate answer, and the fact that the Bible was interpreted in so many different ways, forced him to go to the source, that is, to seek revelation for himself. When the Lord and Christ appear to him, the Father says, "This is my beloved Son." And I think that's an important thing to note, because it's... excuse me just a second. I can't find my file. That is an allusion to a passage from the New Testament. And I think it helps contextualize what's going on here. That occurs in two different events. One is at the baptism of Jesus, where a voice comes from heaven and says, "Thou art my beloved Son," or "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The other is at the Transfiguration. The difference is, in the first, at the baptism, the Father simply says, "This is my beloved Son, I am pleased in him." That at the Transfiguration, he says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him, listen to him." And I think that's important to note, because that's what is said that's what's quoted in this passage, the Transfiguration theophany. That is to say, the Father is introducing the Son, but introducing the Son as a revelator, and Joseph Smith's first vision is a Transfiguration theophany in a sense. That is to say, he is encountering Christ in divine glory as opposed to the Christ, the Jesus that walked the earth in Galilee. So I think that's an important thing to note, is that the language is elusive to the Transfiguration, and Joseph is playing the role, essentially, of Peter, James, and John in his first vision, the role that those three apostles played in the Transfiguration.
Thank you. We're also going to talk about, I think, verses 19 and 20.
Yeah, you want me to do that now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, what the Father said, or what Christ says, is that he uses language that is often thought of as kind of anti-Christian by many anti-Mormons and evangelicals and people who reject Joseph Smith's first vision. The first, he says that all their creeds were an abomination. We need to understand that creeds are, it comes from the Latin credo, which means I believe. And this is a formal list of doctrines that one has to believe to follow, a particular denomination. Why would those creeds be an abomination? I think there's two options. One is that the very act of creed making is not what the Lord wants. That is, there should be no creeds. That's one possible way that the passage might reflect. The other is that the creeds are an abomination because they're false. That is, they contain false teachings. And I think that's an important thing to note, that it's probably the latter. That is, the creeds are bad, they're an abomination because they contain false teachings about the Lord. The second thing they say is that the professors were all corrupt. Now, that's often understood by modern English speakers to mean corrupt in the sense of financially corrupt. That's kind of how we use the term today. Like a politician is corrupt means he, taking bribes or something like that. What he means, if you understand it in its original context, the professors are not university professors. That's not what they're talking about. Those who profess the creeds are corrupt. Now, it doesn't mean they're evil and wicked. It means that the profession, the things they teach have been corrupt. That is, they're adulterated, they're modified, they're not pure. It's not the pure gospel that's being taught by those who profess the creeds. So it's not about it's not a moral judgment that they are wicked or that they are, doing this for money. That may be true, but that's not the essence of what the Lord is saying here. What he's saying is those who profess the creeds are corrupt. That is, they've mixed in stuff. It's not the pure teaching of Christ. It has been corrupted, changed, modified, adulterated, however you want to say it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because we should not be thinking that the Lord is pointing a finger at someone and saying, you're awful and evil. The point of this vision is restoration of the things that had become adulterated or corrupted, and it's to remove those things and come to a pure gospel through which people can be purified. But the point of the vision wasn't to say everybody else is awful. The point of the vision is to say this is to initiate something that will bring this pure gospel back.
Yeah, I had a point here.
Yeah.
This brings us back to this issue of an apostasy, and when you take a look at the basic tenets of Christianity, the nature of God, the nature of Scripture, the nature of salvation, how someone is saved, all of those basic elements had been corrupted to a significant degree, and that's the precise point that Bill is making here.
I wanted to mention that I think it's important that, and I really appreciated what Bill said and what has already been said regarding the fact that there are a number of the people, to be corrupt, at least in that term, a lot of these people were good, sincere people who were trying to do all that they could as far as they were aware. But because of the various doctrines having been corrupted over a very long period of time, while they were doing the best that they could with the limited knowledge, they weren't able to do all that they could or know all that they should in terms of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I really appreciated Bill's explanation there, because I think it shows that Latter-day Saints don't look on every other Christian out there as being some, corrupted, at least in the modern sense. We look at the people being very sincere and doing what they can, but with a limited knowledge.
And I think it's important to remember that Joseph really would have a hard time saying that people who had joined these churches must have been evil, because his mother did, his sisters did, and he's not going to be saying, my mother is corrupt. That just isn't what he's talking about. So he certainly is separating these concepts of an adulterated religion from the concepts the way we would see the word in our modern context. Yeah, and I think that kind of comes to the end of this story, because we have this vision that Joseph Smith has, and then it's sort of kept private. This, although we think of it as the first vision and we think of it as kind of the initiating event, for the people in Joseph's family, this was a religious conversion. Joseph thought of it as a religious conversion. And most of the people who joined the church in the early 1830s would not have heard about this first vision until sometime later, because it was the introduction of the Book of Mormon that became the touchstone for the faith of those people. And later, as Joseph was more comfortable, at least according to Richard L. Bushman, it's this private thing that eventually he's more comfortable with and is talking about, the vision. So it wasn't something that he was publishing abroad to a lot of people. Let's see. I guess that sort of leads us to one of the other things that we probably ought to talk about. Craig, could you talk about the fact that we have different accounts of the first vision?
Sure. As you
Speak up
mentioned,
a bit, Craig.
I'm sorry?
Speak up a bit if you can. It's
Okay.
a little bit faint.
Sure. As you mentioned, and we have mentioned it in our discussion, there were different accounts of the first vision. Richard L. Bushman, in his book, Rough Stone Rolling, discusses the different accounts. And there are several other publications. There's a book by Milton B. Bachman titled Joseph Smith's First Vision, Confirming Evidences and Contemporary Accounts, that talks about the first vision. There are several articles, and there's, in fact, an article that appears in the FAIR website by Stephen C. Harper titled 4 Accounts and 3 Critiques of Joseph Smith's First Vision, in which he mentions that in the 1830s and 1840s, Joseph Smith wrote or caused scribes to write 8 known documents or accounts of the first vision. 5 of the 8 are unique, and the other 3 are copies of the previous ones. Now, critics of the church have said, well, if this really happened to Joseph Smith, why between 1832 and the early 1840s would he have given various accounts of the first vision? Personally, to me, I find it to be actually faith building rather than shocking or troublesome that there are different accounts, because think for yourself as you remember experiences that you have had and you relate it at different points in your life. If you had written down each time that you related an experience, you would notice that there would be variations, because you are remembering different things based upon how you're viewing the world at that time. For example, the earliest account that Joseph Smith gave, the 1832 one, focused a little bit more on the fact that his sins were forgiven and some of the basics. it wasn't until later, as he was viewing the restoration of the gospel and other revelations that he had received, that he began to feel comfortable to bring in other aspects, or perhaps even remembered different aspects, like Martin brought out very well about the fact that it wasn't until a little bit later that he remembered some of the attempts by Satan to stop him from praying, hoping that he would not have his, what we call, the first vision. And so these accounts vary, but the significant thing is they do not vary in the substance of the message, which was that he did receive a visitation and did find out about that at that time, no church, that he should not join any church, etc. So that's kind of a rough overview, but I think that it would be good to look at a couple of these publications as they go into a little bit more detail talking about it.
May I add a thought here?
Please.
Thank you. Each one of these first vision accounts is also often to a really different audience, and that accounts, I think, in great measure for the different way that they're presented. You have one that's basically going to be presented in a newspaper article. Certainly you would present that differently than you would to someone in your own congregation. If you were talking about a major event in your life, you might talk about it in a very different way. Say it was your marriage, to different people, depending on the context. And the real question for critics is, do you see something contradictory, not just something different for a different audience, but something contradictory? And as I've reviewed over the years these different recitals of the first vision, these 8 ones that Craig has mentioned, I see no contradiction. I just see a different recitation to different audiences at different times, emphasizing different points that Joseph Smith thought were important. They're very complementary. As a matter of fact, if they were all the same, I would think somebody had cooked the books. And they're not the same. They're for a different context, each and every one.
Exactly. That's why I said the fact that they differ to a degree, to me, is kind of a confirmation, because of the very fact, like Martin said, if it was exactly the same every single time, then you would have to wonder, did Joseph Smith write this thing down beforehand, memorize it, and was just repeating it over and over? The other thing that really stands out for me, I guess because of my own experiences, when I have had very spiritual experiences, I've considered those very personal, very private. And so the fact that it took a while for Joseph Smith to talk about this, publicly talk about his experience, I think represents or reflects the fact that he viewed this as a very personal, very sacred experience, and I think was hesitant at first to share something so personal, so sacred, except with his family and very close friends. And that's why we don't see it used in the first years as a missionary tool, and it wasn't until later that he finally felt comfortable enough to talk about something that had been so personal and sacred for him.
I think one of the things that I've noticed in multiple scenarios is that we live in a world that's so used to texts that we have historical processes that talk about how one text is related to another. And so there's always this assumption that there's some original back there somewhere and we can run through the text. And what happens in many cases is what we actually have are recorded documents from an oral performance. And in the case of Joseph Smith, that's really what we have, because he's telling these things and they're being written down. And in oral performances, for people who are studying folklore and oral performances, the audience really makes a big difference. So of course it's going to make a difference when that thing is recorded for a particular audience. And the fact that you're going to remember certain details or emphasize certain things and change something around, that again is going to be reflective of the audience, the time, the occasion, what it is that you're trying to do. And so sometimes we make a mistake of applying principles of historical documents when we're really talking about a recorded oral performance, and it's a different process.
I think there's another thing to note about this too, is that we tend to view these documents as the 1832 account as the first account, then the 1835 or 6 or whatever it is, that they come in a chronological sequence. In fact, the first printed version of the first vision is 1842, long after these other ones are written. These are written either as accounts of what he was telling someone, that is an oral presentation, like I said, or they are a journal entry, usually a journal entry saying, I told somebody this, that, and everything, told the account, or a preliminary attempt at a church history that were not published until after. And so we've got to recognize that our perspective of the first vision as the founding revelation of the new dispensation is not the way that was originally conceived. The Book of Mormon is the founding revelation, and the first vision is kind of a personal thing for Joseph Smith, but it's not about founding the church. It's about Joseph Smith's search for God and Joseph Smith's search for the true church. The founding of the church comes after the first vision, but it sets him on the course. So I think that's another important thing to recognize, is that these were not public documents until 1842, the 1842 letter that he wrote to Wentworth that then got published in Times and Seasons. Another thing to note is there's a new book that we should mention. It's called Exploring the First Vision. It's by Samuel Dodge and Stephen Harper. They're editors, and they've collected together the most important essays of the past 20 years, along with some new material about the first vision. And it's a great book that goes into all the different aspects of it, historical, documentary, etc. And it also includes an article by Dean Jesse, which contains every single version of the first vision and his analysis of these as well. So this is a brand new book, just been out a month or two. Well worth taking a look at if you want to pursue this in more detail.
Excellent. Does anybody else have anything else that we should add to this?
One last comment, if I might make one, and that is that critics of the church often take the position that this was made up after the fact. I don't find that to be true for a number of reasons, but one of the ones that critics would have a very hard time explaining is why you have things that I tend to call indicia of authenticity. For example, in the Orson Pratt 1840 account, you have this great little comment where it says that the trees were illuminated and so bright and brilliant that when Joseph Smith saw this happen, he thought the trees were going to burn up. And when that didn't happen, he has this great little sentence where he says he was encouraged with the hope of being able to endure its presence, meaning, oh, the trees didn't burn up, maybe I won't be burned up too. And that's not the kind of a thing that you would say if you were making this up after the fact. As this was unfolding, he didn't have the hindsight of knowing the outcome the way that we do. He was sitting there, he got more than he bargained for. This brilliant light comes down. He thought, whoa, the trees are going to go, and I'm going to go next. And then it hits the trees, and they don't burn up, and he's thinking, wow, I might survive too. And the outcome is glorious when the light actually touches him. But he has these fears along the way that you would never be able to make up after the fact.
And I suppose as a final comment, we all have the opportunity of receiving revelation, and it may not come in that kind of a burning. And frankly, I kind of hope mine don't, but doesn't preclude that they will. Any further comments? If not, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.